Picture this. You're sitting in the most prestigious magic academy in the entire continent, surrounded by students who can summon firestorms with a snap of their fingers, create ice sculptures that could pierce through steel, and manipulate gravity itself. Everyone around you is a prodigy, a chosen one, someone destined for greatness. And then there's you, unable to cast even the simplest light spell, unable to feel even a flicker of mana in your veins. You're not just at the bottom of the class. You're considered an anomaly, a mistake, someone who shouldn't even be there. But what they don't know, what nobody knows, is that deep within your body lies something far more terrifying than any magic they could ever comprehend. 7 ancient seals, each one suppressing a power so catastrophic that the gods themselves feared it. This is the story of how one student went from being the Academy's biggest joke to its most dangerous existence. The morning fog rolled across the crystal towers of Astravelle Academy, like ghostly fingers reaching for the sky. This wasn't just any magic school. This was the birthplace of legends, the forge where heroes were shaped, the sacred ground where the greatest mages in history first learned to bend reality to their will. Its spires pierced the clouds, each one carved from luminescent stone that pulsed with residual magical energy from centuries of spell casting. The academy grounds sprawled across an entire mountain range, with floating islands connected by bridges of pure, solidified mana. Gardens bloomed with flowers that sang at dawn. Libraries housed books that rewrote themselves based on the reader's magical aptitude. And training grounds bore scars from battles fought by students who would go on to reshape the world. But beneath all that beauty, beneath all that prestige, Astravelle Academy held secrets, dark ones, the kind of secrets that get buried in restricted archives and whispered about only in the dead of night. See, Astravelle wasn't just built as a school, it was built as a prison, a containment facility disguised as an educational institution. The founding mages, those legendary figures whose statues now decorated every courtyard, they didn't just create this place to teach magic. They created it to watch over something ancient, something that had been sealed away long before the first spell was ever taught within these walls. The headmaster's tower, the tallest and most imposing structure in the entire academy, contained floors that students were forbidden to visit. Not because they were dangerous, though they absolutely were, but because they held artifacts from what the historical records carefully termed as the Sealing Era. That period in history, when the greatest magical minds united to lock away powers too dangerous for mortal comprehension. Powers that could unravel the fabric of reality. Powers that could turn a single person into a walking catastrophe. Powers that, if unleashed, would make the difference between a master mage and a novice look like the difference between a mountain and a grain of sand. Into this academy, into this pressure cooker of magical excellence and hidden darkness, walked our protagonist. His name was Kael Vornath, and he was about to discover that being powerless wasn't his curse, it was his protection. Kael had what you might call a complicated relationship with magic. Actually, complicated is putting it lightly. He had no relationship with it whatsoever. While other students his age were already manifesting their elemental affinities, creating light shows that would make fireworks jealous, Kael couldn't even make a candle flicker. The aptitude tests, those magical examinations that determined a student's potential, they all came back the same way for him. 0, null, nothing. The crystalline orbs that measured magical capacity didn't just fail to glow in his presence. They actively dimmed, as if his very existence was somehow antithetical to magic itself. His acceptance to Astravelle Academy had been a mistake. At least, that's what everyone assumed. Some clerical error, some cosmic joke, some bizarre twist of fate that allowed a completely magicless individual to receive an acceptance letter to the most elite magical institution in the world. The professors had tried to be diplomatic about it. They'd suggested perhaps he'd been accepted for administrative studies, or maybe as a historian, or possibly to work in the kitchens, anything but actually study magic. because how could you study something you couldn't even perceive? But Kael's family name carried weight. The Vornath bloodline had produced archmages for 7 generations. His great-great-grandmother had been one of the legendary founders of modern elemental theory. His grandfather had served as the kingdom's court mage, advisor to 3 different kings. His father currently held a seat on the Continental Magic Council. The Vornath name opened doors. It also created expectations. Crushing, suffocating expectations that Kael could feel pressing down on his shoulders with every dismissive glance from his classmates. The other students at Astravelle fell into distinct categories. There were the naturally gifted ones, those who seemed to breathe magic as easily as air. They walked through the halls with an unconscious grace, their robes shimmering with latent power, their very presence causing minor magical phenomena. Candles would brighten when they passed. Flowers would turn to face them. The ambient mana in the air would actually flow toward them, drawn by the gravitational pull of their immense magical potential. These students barely needed to study. Magic was intuitive to them, an extension of their will made manifest in reality. Then there were the hard workers. Students with moderate talent who made up for it with dedication and discipline. They spent hours in the practice halls, perfecting their spell forms, memorizing incantations, studying magical theory until their eyes crossed. They would probably never revolutionize the field, but they'd graduate as competent mages, capable of respectable spell work and solid magical understanding. And then there was Kael, in a category entirely his own, a statistical impossibility, a magical null. The professors had even tested him for curse marks, thinking perhaps some malevolent spell had been placed on him to suppress his abilities. Nothing. They'd checked for mana blockages in his meridians. Clear. They'd examined him for rare conditions like arcane rejection syndrome or elemental inversion. Negative on all counts. Kael wasn't cursed. He wasn't blocked. He wasn't sick. He simply had absolutely no magical capability whatsoever. His daily routine had become an exercise in humiliation. Morning classes on elemental manipulation, where he sat in the back, unable to even feel the mana currents the professor was describing. Afternoon practical sessions where he'd stand awkwardly while other students conjured flames and ice, wind and stone, light and shadow. Evening studies in the library where the magical texts literally wouldn't open for him, their enchanted bindings requiring a minimum mana signature to activate. Even the Academy's basic convenience spells wouldn't work in his presence. Floating quills fell when he walked by. Magical lights needed manual lighting. Cleaning spells fizzled out. He was like a black hole of magical incompetence, and everyone knew it. The bullying started subtle. Whispered comments about how he must have blackmailed his way into the Academy. Jokes about how the Vornath bloodline must have finally run dry. Casual shoulder bumps in the hallway that knocked his books flying. But as weeks turned to months, it escalated. Students started using him for target practice, knowing he couldn't defend himself with counterspells. They'd cast minor hexes that would make him trip, or cause his food to taste like dirt, or give him temporary hiccups that lasted for hours. Nothing serious enough to get them expelled, but enough to make every single day a new flavor of misery. The worst part wasn't the bullying, though. The worst part was the pity. The way professors would look at him with these sad, sympathetic eyes, like he was a wounded animal that someone needed to put out of its misery. The way other students would occasionally try to befriend him out of some misguided sense of charity, only to drift away when they realized he had nothing to offer their social standing. The way even the Academy staff treated him like he was made of glass, speaking in those careful, measured tones people use around the terminally ill. What none of them knew, what Kael himself didn't even know, was that his lack of magic wasn't a weakness. It was a symptom, a side effect of something far more significant. You see, inside Kael's body, woven through his very soul like chains made of ancient script and divine authority, were 7 seals, each one a masterwork of magical engineering that would make modern enchantments look like children's drawings. each one designed by the greatest seal masters of a forgotten age, each one consuming every single drop of magical energy his body could produce just to maintain its existence. These weren't simple binding spells. These were reality anchors, metaphysical locks forged from the combined power of 12 archmagi who had sacrificed their lives to create something that could contain the uncontainable. The seals operated on principles of magic so advanced that modern magical theory hadn't even discovered the fundamentals yet. They drew power not just from Kael's mana, but from his very life force, from the ambient energy of the world around him, from the cosmic background magic that permeated all of existence. They were parasitic and perfect, invisible and invincible, dormant and devastating. And they were starting to crack. It started on a night that seemed like any other. Kael had just endured another particularly brutal day. First-year combat training had been a disaster, as usual. The instructor, Professor Aldrich Thornhart, was an old battle mage who believed that the best way to learn defensive magic was through aggressive offense. He'd pair students up for sparring matches, encouraging them to push their limits, to discover their magical instincts under pressure. It was effective teaching for students who actually had magic. For Kael, it was just sanctioned assault. His opponent that day had been Darius Goldweave, a noble's son with more arrogance than actual skill, but enough raw magical power to make up for it. Darius specialized in force magic, the kind of blunt, straightforward combat spells favored by those who'd rather overwhelm their opponents than outthink them. The match had been predictably one-sided. Kael dodging and weaving, trying desperately to avoid the barrage of force bolts and pressure waves, while Darius laughed and called out increasingly creative insults about Kael's lack of magical defense. The match ended when Darius got bored with playing around and hit Kael with a full-powered force blast that sent him crashing into the arena wall, hard enough to crack the reinforced stone. Professor Thornhart had called the match, given Darius a mild reprimand for excessive force, and dismissed the class. Kael had limped to the infirmary with what he suspected were at least 2 broken ribs, only to be informed that healing spells wouldn't work on him properly because his body rejected external mana. The Academy healers could set bones and apply salves, but magical acceleration of natural healing? Impossible. He'd need to recover the old-fashioned way. So Kael found himself back in his dorm room, a small single-occupancy chamber in the least desirable wing of the student housing. The Academy had thought it prudent to give him privacy, though Kael suspected it was more about keeping him away from the other students, who might complain about living near someone so magically deficient. The room was sparse. A narrow bed, a wooden desk, a single shelf for books he couldn't read, a window that looked out over the training grounds where students practiced spells he'd never be able to cast. He collapsed onto his bed, every breath sending sharp pains through his chest. The physical pain was almost welcome. It was real, tangible, something he could understand. Not like the hollow ache of magical inadequacy that had become his constant companion. He stared at the ceiling, at the cracks in the plaster that formed shapes if you looked at them long enough. A dragon. A sword. A prison cell. Sleep came slowly, painfully, and with it came the dreams. Except these weren't normal dreams. Kael had experienced his share of nightmares, the kind where you're falling forever or showing up to class naked, or watching helplessly as everyone around you achieves greatness while you remain frozen in place. But this was different. This dream had texture, weight, reality. He stood in a vast chamber carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The walls were covered in script he couldn't read but somehow understood. Languages that predated human civilization. Symbols that represented concepts magic couldn't quite capture. 7 pillars rose from the floor, each one pulsing with a different color. Crimson, azure, emerald, gold, violet, silver, obsidian, and wrapped around each pillar were chains. Not physical chains, but chains made of pure magical force. glowing with an intensity that hurt to look at directly. At the center of the 7 pillars, suspended in midair by threads of energy so thin they were barely visible, was a figure. Kael moved closer, his dream self walking without conscious thought, drawn by some fundamental pull he couldn't resist. As he approached, the figure's features became clear. It was him. Or rather, it was a version of him. Same face, same build, but different in every way that mattered. This version radiated power. Not the gentle glow of a skilled mage or the bright flare of raw talent. This was the kind of power that made reality itself seem negotiable. A presence so overwhelming that the space around him warped, bent, twisted into shapes that shouldn't exist. The bound figure's eyes opened. They were the same color as Kael's, that ordinary brown that had always seemed so disappointingly mundane. But these eyes contained depths, galaxies, voids, the kind of infinity that comes from existing so far beyond mortal comprehension that perspective itself becomes meaningless. When the figure spoke, it wasn't with a voice. The words appeared directly in Kael's mind, bypassing all normal sensory channels. Finally, you're beginning to perceive. The first seal weakens. Kael wanted to ask what this meant, who this was, what was happening. But before he could form the questions, pain exploded through his chest. Not the dull ache of broken ribs, but something far more profound. It felt like something inside him was cracking, breaking, shattering into pieces that could never be reassembled. The 7 pillars began to shake. The chains around them glowed brighter, straining against bonds that had held for longer than kingdoms had existed. The crimson pillar, the first pillar, developed a crack. Small at first, barely visible, but growing, spreading like a spiderweb across the surface. And with each millimeter that crack extended, power leaked out. Raw, unfiltered, absolutely devastating power that made the air itself scream. Kael woke up screaming. His dorm room was in chaos. Not the normal kind of chaos of a messy student's living space, but genuine physical chaos. His bed had risen 3 feet off the ground and was slowly rotating. Books that should have been on his shelf were floating in geometric patterns around the room. The window had shattered outward, glass hanging suspended in midair like frozen rain. And most terrifyingly, his hands were glowing with crimson light, the same color as the first pillar from his dream. He tried to move, to stand up, to do anything. But the moment he shifted his weight, everything in the room responded. The floating books shot toward the walls, embedding themselves in the stone. The bed crashed down, splintering its frame. The suspended glass exploded outward in a shower that should have shredded everything in its path, but instead curved around Kael in perfect arcs, as if obeying commands he didn't know he was giving. The door to his room burst open. Professor Thornhart stood in the doorway, staff already raised, magical defenses shimmering around him in layers. He'd probably felt the magical disturbance from wherever instructors went after hours. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the destruction, the impossible physics, the light emanating from Kael's hands. And for the first time since Kael had met the gruff old battle mage, he saw something in those eyes he'd never seen before. Fear. But not fear of Kael. Fear for him. The professor's gaze wasn't looking at a threat. It was looking at a student in danger. A young person who'd suddenly manifested power with no training, no control, no understanding of what was happening. Thornhart moved with surprising speed for a man of his age, crossing the room in 3 steps, staff blazing with containment spells that filled the air with geometric patterns of light. "Don't fight it," Thornhart commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Don't try to push the power down. Don't try to control it. Just breathe. Let it flow through you like water. You're not a dam, you're a riverbank. Guide it, don't block it." Kael tried to follow the instructions, but his panic was making everything worse. Every breath seemed to pull more crimson light from some impossible source inside him. The walls were starting to crack now, stone that had stood for centuries developing fissures from the pressure of magic that shouldn't exist in someone who had been magically null just hours before. Other professors were arriving now. Kael could hear them outside, shouting orders, establishing containment barriers, evacuating nearby students. Through his panic, through the overwhelming sensation of power that felt like liquid fire in his veins, he caught fragments of their conversation. Impossible. His magical signature was 0 yesterday. Some kind of breakthrough? Delayed manifestation? No, this is different. This energy signature, I've never seen anything like it. Get the headmaster now. The crimson light was getting brighter. Kael could feel something inside him, like a door that had been sealed shut. His entire life was being forced open. And behind that door was something vast. Something that had been waiting. Something that knew him better than he knew himself. Professor Thornhart was still talking, his voice cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. Focus on my voice. You're not dying. You're not broken. This is just power. It's not good or evil. It's not a curse or a blessing. It's just energy, and energy can be directed. Picture it like a river. Where do you want it to flow? Where did Kael want it to flow? He didn't want it at all. He wanted his normal life back. He wanted to be invisible again. He wanted to go back to being nobody, nothing, a statistical error that didn't matter. But even as the thought formed, he felt something respond inside him. The power surged, not outward in destruction, but inward, flowing back to wherever it had come from. The crimson light in his hands dimmed. The objects in the room began to settle. The pressure in the air decreased. And then he heard it. That voice from his dream, speaking directly into his mind again. Interesting. You choose the cage. But the seal is broken, child. What was bound is now free, whether you accept it or not. The question isn't whether you'll use this power. It's whether you'll learn to use it before someone else learns to use you. The power vanished as suddenly as it appeared. The crimson light winked out. Kael collapsed, unconscious before he hit the floor. He woke up 3 days later in the academy infirmary, in a private room that was probably meant for emergencies far more conventional than magical outbursts from students who shouldn't have magic at all. The first thing he noticed was that he felt different. Not physically better, he still ached everywhere, but different in a fundamental way. Like he'd been looking at the world through frosted glass his entire life, and someone had just wiped it clean. The second thing he noticed was that he could feel mana. Not just sense it vaguely, the way someone might feel a breeze or sense a change in temperature. He could feel it the way he felt his own heartbeat. The ambient magical energy that filled the air, that he'd been completely blind to for 17 years, was now as clear to him as sight or sound. It flowed through the room in currents and eddies, pooling in corners, swirling around objects, responding to emotions and intentions. It was everywhere. It was everything. And he could feel all of it. A healer noticed he was awake and immediately went to fetch someone. Within minutes, his room filled with authority figures. Headmaster Evandrius Blackwood, a tall man with silver hair, and eyes that seemed to look not just at you but through you, into the core of who you were. Professor Thornhart, looking tired but relieved. And 2 people Kael didn't recognize. One was a woman in robes that seemed to shift colors depending on the angle, covered in protective enchantments so dense they made the air around her shimmer. The other was a man who looked like he'd forgotten to sleep for the past month, with ink-stained fingers and the expression of intense, slightly manic curiosity. Headmaster Blackwood spoke first. His voice was measured, careful, the kind of tone people use when they're not sure if they're talking to a person or a ticking bomb. Mr. Vornath, how are you feeling? Kael considered the question. How was he feeling? Terrified, confused, impossibly aware of every magical thread in the room. I can feel mana now, he said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. I couldn't before, but now I can. The ink-stained man's eyes lit up. Fascinating. A complete magical null experiencing sudden onset mana sensitivity. The implications for magical development theory are staggering. We need to run tests, establish a baseline, track the progression of your Archimedes. Headmaster Blackwood's voice was sharp. Later. The woman in shifting robes stepped forward. My name is Professor Seraphine Vex. I specialize in curse-breaking and binding magic. I've examined you while you were unconscious. Mr. Vornath, are you aware that you have seals inside your body? The question hit Kael like a physical blow. Seals. Like in his dream. The 7 pillars. The chains. The version of himself bound and waiting. I had a dream, he said slowly. 7 pillars, 7 colors, something was chained. Professor Vex and Headmaster Blackwood exchanged a look that Kael couldn't quite decipher. That wasn't a dream, Vex said gently. That was your mind finally perceiving what's been there all along. You have 7 major seals inscribed directly into your soul. They're ancient, extraordinarily ancient. The kind of work that requires multiple archmages working in concert, and even then, only as their final act because creating seals of this magnitude is fatal to the caster. What are they sealing? Kael asked, though part of him already knew the answer. The bound figure in his dream. The power that had exploded out of him. The way reality itself had seemed negotiable for those few minutes of chaos. That, said Headmaster Blackwood, is what we're trying to determine. What we do know is that the first seal has been compromised. Not broken entirely, but cracked. Damaged enough that it's bleeding power. That crimson energy you manifested 3 days ago? That's leakage from whatever the seal was designed to contain. And if that was just leakage, I don't want to imagine what the full power looks like. Professor Thornhart spoke up. The question isn't what's sealed. The question is why. Seals like this aren't used to contain demons or evil spirits. Those require different methodology. Seals of this specific configuration are used for one purpose: to contain power that's too great for the vessel to handle. Power that would destroy the host if released all at once. They're not prisons. They're safety mechanisms. Safety mechanisms for what? Kael demanded. None of this made sense. He'd been nobody his entire life. Nothing. A disappointment to his family, a joke to his peers, a statistical impossibility to his teachers. How could someone like him have anything worth sealing? The ink-stained man, Archimedes, couldn't contain himself anymore. Don't you see? You were never magically null. You had more mana than any of us. More than all of us combined, probably. But every drop of it was being consumed just to maintain those seals. They're parasitic constructs. Drawing on your life force, your mana generation, everything. You've been operating at a deficit your entire life, using energy just to stay sealed. But something triggered a weakening. A crack in the first seal. And now that crack is expanding. Can you fix it? Kael asked. Reseal it? Professor Vex shook her head. Seals don't work that way. Once they start to fail, the process is irreversible. We could maybe slow the degradation, buy you some time. But eventually, all 7 seals are going to fail. And when they do, whatever power they're containing will be fully unleashed. Kael felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. So what happens to me? Do I explode? Do I go insane? Do I become some kind of monster? We don't know, Headmaster Blackwood said, and his honesty was almost worse than a lie would have been. What we do know is that you're going to experience 6 more breakthroughs similar to what happened 3 days ago, each one corresponding to one of the remaining seals, each one potentially more powerful than the last. And we need to make sure you're prepared. We need to teach you control, understanding, discipline, because right now, you're like a child who's been handed the most dangerous weapon in existence with no instruction manual. Over the following weeks, Kael's life transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The student who'd been invisible, who'd been pitied and mocked in equal measure, suddenly became the Academy's most carefully watched individual. Not quite a prisoner, but not quite free either. He had constant supervision, specialized tutors, and a training regimen that would make military boot camp look relaxing. His mornings started before dawn, with meditation exercises led by Professor Vex. Not the peaceful, relaxing kind of meditation, but intense mental discipline designed to help him perceive and navigate his internal magical landscape. She taught him to visualize his mana core, that central nexus where magical energy pooled and circulated. For most students, this core was a simple construct, a ball of light or a pool of water or some other straightforward visualization. Kael's core was different. It looked like a prison. 7 concentric rings of chains and symbols, each one surrounding a different colored flame. 6 of them burned steady and constant. One, the crimson flame corresponding to the first seal, flickered and surged unpredictably. Afternoons were spent in practical training with Professor Thornhart. Not combat magic, not yet. First, he needed to learn the absolute basics: control, precision, intent. Thornhart would have him practice moving a single leaf across a table using the leaked power from his damaged seal. Just one leaf, moving it 1 inch at a time. Kael, who could now feel enough power inside him to level buildings, spent hours learning to use the tiniest possible fraction of that power without letting the rest surge out. Evenings belonged to Archimedes, whose full name turned out to be Professor Archimedes Theoron, Master of Magical Theory and Historical Arcana. These sessions were less practical training and more interrogation disguised as education. Archimedes wanted to know everything: what Kael felt when he accessed the crimson power, what images came to mind, what his body temperature did, what colors he saw, what sounds he heard. Every data point was recorded in notebooks that Archimedes filled at an alarming rate. But it was during these evening sessions that Kael learned the most about what was happening to him. Archimedes had been researching seal magic, diving into restricted archives, consulting with experts across the continent. What he discovered was both enlightening and terrifying. The seals inside Kael weren't random. They followed a specific sequence, a pattern that corresponded to something called the 7 aspects of sovereign power. Ancient magical theory, predating the founding of Astravelle Academy by at least 1,000 years, held that true mastery required balancing 7 fundamental forces: destruction and creation, knowledge and ignorance, order and chaos, and at the center, binding them all together, sovereignty itself. Each of Kael's seals corresponded to one of these aspects. The crimson seal that had cracked first was destruction, the power to unmake, to tear down, to reduce anything to its component parts. The azure seal was creation, the ability to bring forth something from nothing, to impose will onto reality so absolutely that new things simply existed because you demanded they should. Emerald was knowledge, the capacity to understand, to learn, to perceive truths that were hidden from normal perception. Gold was ignorance, the power to hide, to obscure, to make things unknowable. Violet was order, the force that created structure, hierarchy, predictable patterns. Silver was chaos, the wild unpredictability that broke all patterns. And obsidian, the 7th and final seal, was sovereignty, the power to rule, to command, to make your will absolute. No single person should have access to all 7 aspects, Archimedes explained one evening, his voice unusually serious. The last recorded individual who achieved balance across all 7 became known as the Calamity King. He reshaped the entire northern continent according to his whims, before a coalition of every magical nation combined forces to seal him away. It took them 300 years to gather enough power for the sealing ritual. And even then, they didn't kill him. They couldn't. Someone with mastery over all 7 aspects is functionally immortal. They just locked him in a dimensional prison and hoped it would hold. "Are you saying I'm going to become like this Calamity King?" Kael asked, ice forming in his stomach. "I'm saying," Archimedes replied carefully, "that whoever placed these seals on you thought it necessary to lock away power comparable to what the Calamity King wielded. Whether that makes you dangerous or powerful or both is something we'll only know once all the seals fail." The social dynamics of the academy had shifted dramatically as well. Students who'd previously ignored or mocked Kael now gave him a wide berth. Not out of respect, exactly. Out of fear. Word had spread about what happened in his dorm room. The stories had grown in the telling, as stories do. Some said he'd destroyed half the building. Others claimed he'd been possessed by a demon. A few swore he'd briefly transformed into something inhuman before passing out. Darius Goldweave, Kael's former bully, avoided him entirely now. The other students who'd used Kael for target practice found new victims to torment. Even the professors treated him differently, with a mixture of scientific curiosity and cautious respect. There was one exception, though. A girl named Lyra Shadowmend. She was in Kael's year, but a completely different tier of magical ability. While Kael had been struggling with being magically null, Lyra had been earning top marks in every practical examination. She specialized in shadow magic, that tricky discipline that walked the line between illusion and reality, using darkness not as the absence of light, but as a substance in its own right. She approached him one afternoon after a particularly exhausting training session with Professor Thornhart. Kael was sitting in the academy's eastern garden, a quiet space where few students ventured, trying to calm his racing heart and the crimson power that wanted to surge every time his emotions spiked. "They're all afraid of you now," Lyra said without preamble, settling onto the bench beside him. "The same people who made your life hell for months are now terrified you'll do the same to them." Kael looked at her, trying to gauge her intent. Unlike most students, Lyra had never been cruel to him. She hadn't been friendly either, but she'd treated him with basic courtesy, which in Kael's experience was already remarkable. "And you're not afraid?" She smiled, and it was a strange smile. Not mocking, but knowing. "I'm terrified, but I'm also fascinated. Do you know what the difference is between fear and respect, Kael?" "Distance. Fear keeps you far away. Respect brings you closer. I want to understand what's happening to you. Not because I want to use you or manipulate you or anything so cliché, but because I think you're going to fundamentally change something about how we understand magic, and I want a front row seat." Her honesty was refreshing. Everyone else danced around the topic, using careful language and diplomatic phrases. Lyra just stated her truth directly. "I don't even understand what's happening to me," Kael admitted. "How am I supposed to change anything?" "That's exactly why you will," Lyra said. "The people who change things are never the ones who have all the answers. They're the ones who have questions nobody else thought to ask." Over the following weeks, Lyra became something Kael hadn't had since arriving at Astravelle. A friend. She'd join him for meals in the dining hall, creating a buffer between him and the stares from other students. She'd study with him in the library, helping him catch up on all the basic magical theory he'd missed while being magically null. She challenged him intellectually, asking questions about his seal experience that nobody else dared to ask. "What does it feel like?" she asked him one evening. They were in the library, surrounded by books on historical seal magic that Archimedes had recommended. "When you access the crimson power, what do you actually feel?" Kael considered the question. He'd tried to explain it to his professors, but they always approached it from a clinical perspective, looking for data points and measurable phenomena. Lyra was asking something different. She wanted to understand the experience. "It's like," he said slowly, "being filled with infinite endings. That probably sounds insane. But when I touch that power, I don't feel strong or dangerous. I feel aware. Aware of everything that's temporary. Every structure that will eventually crumble. Every relationship that will eventually end. Every star that will eventually burn out. The Crimson Power isn't about violence or destruction in the normal sense. It's about entropy, the fundamental truth that all things given enough time come apart. Lyra was quiet for a moment, and Kael worried he'd said too much, revealed too much of the strangeness that was becoming his existence. But when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than disturbed. That's beautiful in a terrifying kind of way. Most people think of destruction as crude. Explosions and violence and chaos. But you're describing something more fundamental. The actual nature of impermanence. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the main hall. Raised voices, the sound of magical barriers being erected, the distinctive smell of ozone that accompanied powerful spell work. Kael and Lyra exchanged glances and rushed toward the noise. They found a crowd gathered in the central atrium, a massive space where the Academy's main corridors converged. At the center of the crowd stood 3 figures Kael didn't recognize. Their robes marked them as official representatives, the kind of formal dress worn by magical investigators or council envoys. Headmaster Blackwood stood facing them, his expression carefully neutral. One of the investigators, a severe-looking woman with gray streaks in her black hair, was speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We're not questioning your authority, Headmaster. We're questioning your judgment. The Continental Magic Council has received reports about a student experiencing uncontrolled magical manifestations. Manifestations powerful enough to damage Academy property. Such incidents fall under our jurisdiction. Mr. Vornath is my student," Blackwood replied, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "He's under Academy supervision, receiving specialized training. There have been no incidents since the initial manifestation. No threat to other students. No reason for council intervention." "No reason?" The woman's voice rose. "A previously null student suddenly manifests power comparable to a masterclass mage? That's not growth, Headmaster. That's anomalous. That's dangerous. And under Continental Magical Law Article 7, the Council has authority to detain and examine any individual demonstrating anomalous magical phenomena." Kael felt the crimson power stir inside him, responding to his spike of fear. This was it. They were going to take him away. Lock him up in some council facility. Study him like an experiment. Turn him into a weapon or a prisoner or both. But before anyone could move, Lyra stepped forward. Her voice rang out clear and confident. "Article 7 only applies to individuals who pose an immediate threat to public safety. Kael has been at this academy for weeks since his manifestation. No incidents, no injuries, no property damage beyond his initial awakening. If the council wants to claim authority, they need to demonstrate actual danger, not hypothetical risk." The investigator turned her attention to Lyra, with a look that could have frozen fire. "And who are you to lecture the council on magical law?" "Lyra Shadowmend, daughter of Counselor Marcus Shadowmend, head of the Magical Ethics Committee. And before you ask, yes, my father taught me enough law to recognize overreach when I see it." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Headmaster Blackwood looked like he was trying very hard not to smile. The investigator's jaw clenched. The crowd of students watching began whispering furiously. This was better than any academic drama they could have imagined. Before the situation could escalate further, Professor Vex appeared at the edge of the crowd. She moved with purpose, her shifting robes creating an almost hypnotic effect as she walked. When she spoke, everyone fell silent. "If the Continental Council wishes to examine young Mr. Vornath's seals, I welcome the collaboration. As the Academy's foremost seal specialist, I've documented every aspect of his condition. I'd be happy to share my findings with qualified council researchers." The emphasis on qualified was subtle but unmistakable. The investigator clearly recognized she was outmaneuvered. She couldn't demand Kael's detention without cause, especially not with a counselor's daughter calling out legal overreach and the headmaster backing his student. She settled for a stiff nod. "We'll be requesting copies of all documentation. and we expect immediate notification if there are any future incidents." "Of course," Blackwood replied smoothly. As always, Astravelle Academy maintains full transparency with council oversight. The investigators departed, and the crowd dispersed, already gossiping about what they'd witnessed. Kael felt like he could breathe again. Lyra appeared at his side, looking pleased with herself. "That was risky," Kael said. "They could make trouble for your father." "My father has spent his entire career making trouble for people who abuse their authority," Lyra replied. "He'll be proud I invoked his name for something worthwhile." That night, Kael couldn't sleep. The confrontation with the council investigators had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He'd been so focused on understanding and controlling the Crimson power that he hadn't considered the political implications of his existence. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was an anomaly, a mystery, a potential threat that people with power would want to either control or eliminate. He found himself drawn to the Academy's tallest tower, a structure officially off-limits to students, but Kael had discovered the access codes were surprisingly simple if you watched the professors carefully. The observation deck at the tower's peak offered a view of the entire Academy grounds, spread out below like a constellation of lights in the darkness. Standing there, feeling the wind that somehow never quite reached the ground level, Kael tried to process everything that had happened. A month ago, he'd been nobody. Now he was a political incident waiting to happen. A month ago, he'd been magically dead. Now he had enough power inside him to shake the foundations of the continent's oldest magical institution. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" a voice said behind him. Kael spun around to find Headmaster Blackwood standing in the doorway to the observation deck. The old mage looked tired, more tired than Kael had ever seen him. "I'm sorry, Headmaster. I know students aren't supposed to be up here." "The rule is there to prevent accidents. You, Mr. Vornath, are already an accident. Might as well enjoy the scenery." Blackwood moved to stand beside him at the railing. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the lights of the Academy below. "You're wondering if this is worth it?" It wasn't a question. Kael nodded anyway. "Everyone is afraid of me. The council wants to lock me up. I've got 6 more seal failures ahead of me, each one potentially worse than the last. And I still don't know why. Why me? Why these seals? What am I supposed to become?" "The wrong questions," Blackwood said gently. "You're asking about purpose and destiny and grand design. But those are questions for philosophers and priests. You're a student. Your questions should be simpler. What do I want to learn? How do I want to grow? Who do I want to become? Not who you're supposed to be. Who you choose to be. How do I choose when I don't even understand what I am?" "Nobody understands what they are, Kael. That's the human condition. We're all making it up as we go, trying to figure out who we are while simultaneously becoming that person. The only difference between you and other students is the scale of power involved. But the fundamental challenge is the same. You wake up each day and decide what kind of person you want to be. Everything else is just details." Kael wanted to argue that his situation was more complicated than that. But something about Blackwood's words resonated. He'd been so caught up in the mystery of his seals, in the fear of what he might become, that he'd forgotten the simpler question. What did he want? What would Kael Vornath, setting aside all the prophecies and fears and expectations, actually choose to do with this power? "I want to understand it," Kael said slowly. "Not just control it. I want to know what these seals are, why they were placed, what power they're containing. I want answers." Blackwood smiled, and it was an approving smile. "Good. Now you're asking the right questions. Come with me. There's something you should see." They descended from the observation deck and made their way through corridors Kael had never traveled. The deeper they went into the Academy's central structure, the older everything became. The modern magical lighting gave way to ancient runic illumination. The smooth walls became rougher, carved stone that predated modern construction techniques. They were going down into the foundations of Astravelle, into the parts of the academy that existed before it became a school. They reached a massive door, sealed with so many protective enchantments that just looking at it made Kael's eyes water. Blackwood produced a key that wasn't quite physical, more a construct of intent and authority, and pressed it against the door's central rune. The enchantments peeled away layer by layer until the door swung open with a groan of ancient hinges. Beyond was a chamber that took Kael's breath away. It was identical to the space from his dream. The same black stone, the same 7 pillars, the same chains and symbols, but this wasn't inside his mind. This was real, physical, existing in objective reality. "Welcome," Blackwood said, "to the sealing chamber. This is where Astravelle Academy actually began. Not as a school, as a containment facility, built around this room specifically." Kael moved forward slowly, drawn by the same inexplicable pull he'd felt in his dream. The pillars were arranged in the same configuration, each one corresponding to one of the seals inside him. The crimson pillar had a matching crack, running up its surface in the exact same pattern as the damaged seal in his core. "This place is connected to me, to what's inside me." "More than connected," Blackwood said. "This chamber is a physical anchor point for your seals. They exist both inside you and here, in this space. It's called dual binding, a technique so advanced that modern magic can barely comprehend it. The seals don't just lock away power. They split that power between 2 locations. Half inside you, half here. It means that even if someone tried to forcibly break your seals, they'd only release half the power. The other half would remain locked in this chamber." Kael reached out to touch the crimson pillar. The moment his fingers made contact, he felt it. A connection deeper than thought. This wasn't just a representation. This was part of him. An extension of his very soul made manifest in stone and symbol. Through the pillar, he could feel the seal inside him more clearly than ever before. He could sense the crack, could almost understand the intricate magical architecture that held it together despite the damage. And beneath the seal, he could feel what it was containing. The aspect of destruction in its purest form. Not violence, not cruelty, just the fundamental truth of endings. The power that allowed things to change by allowing things to end. The force that made room for new growth by clearing away the old. It was terrifying in its simplicity, and beautiful in its necessity. "The Academy's founders," Blackwood continued, "believed this chamber was sealing away a great evil, a demon or a calamity or some force of pure destruction. They built the school around it as a way to monitor it, to ensure the seals held. Generations of headmasters passed down the responsibility of protecting this chamber. We all thought we were guarding the world from some ancient horror. But we were wrong," Kael said, understanding dawning. "You weren't guarding the world from something imprisoned here. You were guarding this chamber, waiting for whoever the seals were actually placed on." "Exactly. 17 years ago, a woman appeared at the academy. Pregnant. Dying. She had maybe days left, ravaged by some magical affliction we couldn't identify. She begged us to perform a ritual she'd brought with her. A seal transfer. She said her child would be born with power too great to control. Power that would destroy him if left unchecked. She'd spent her entire pregnancy preparing seals, working magic that should have been impossible for a single mage. All she needed was an anchor point. Somewhere the seals could be stabilized. "This chamber," Kael whispered. "This chamber. We performed the ritual. The moment you were born, the seals activated. They drew power from you, from this chamber, from the ambient mana of the entire academy. Your mother died the moment the ritual completed. Her last words were, 'Protect him until he's ready.' We've been trying to honor that ever since." Kael felt tears running down his face. His mother. A woman he'd never known, who died giving him life and the chains that came with it. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because we didn't know what you needed to be ready for. Your mother left no other explanation. Just that cryptic final message. We could study the seals, observe their effects, but we couldn't understand their purpose. Until you started to change. Until the first seal began to fail and we realized the truth. The seals weren't meant to last forever. They were meant to buy time. Time for you to grow, to develop, to become strong enough mentally and emotionally to handle the power they contained. Your mother wasn't cursing you, Kael. She was protecting you, giving you a childhood, a life, a chance to become a person before you became a power. The weight of that knowledge was almost too much. Kael sank to his knees, his hand still touching the crimson pillar. His mother had sacrificed everything to give him this chance, to let him be weak so he could learn to be strong, to let him be nobody so he could choose who to become. The seals weren't a curse. They were a gift. A gift bought with a price he was only beginning to understand. The other seals will fail, Kael said. All of them, eventually. What happens then? Then, Blackwood said, you'll have access to all 7 aspects: destruction, creation, knowledge, ignorance, order, chaos, and sovereignty. You'll have the power to reshape reality itself. And the question will be simple. What will you choose to do with it? I don't know, Kael admitted. I can barely handle one aspect. How am I supposed to balance 7? One day at a time, one choice at a time, one seal at a time. Blackwood placed a hand on Kael's shoulder. Your mother believed you were capable of this. I'm choosing to believe her. The Academy will support you, train you, protect you, but ultimately, the path forward is yours to walk. The next morning, Kael woke with a new sense of purpose. He'd spent so long being afraid of what he might become that he'd forgotten he could choose who to be. The seals would fail. That was inevitable. But how he handled each failure, what he learned from each aspect, what kind of person he became through the process, that was up to him. His training intensified. Not just physical and magical training, but philosophical and ethical training as well. Professor Vex brought in specialists in each of the 7 aspects, masters who'd spent their entire lives studying one particular force. They taught Kael not just how to use the powers, but why certain applications were wise and others were dangerous. The Master of Destruction was an old woman named Catalyst, who'd spent decades as a demolition expert, bringing down structures safely and efficiently. She taught Kael that destruction wasn't about rage or power, it was about precision, about knowing exactly what needed to end and having the discipline to end only that. Anyone can destroy everything, she told him. The real skill is destroying exactly what needs to go while preserving everything else. As weeks turned to months, Kael began to understand the crimson aspect more deeply. He learned to use it for constructive purposes. Removing curses was just controlled destruction of magical constructs. Healing certain injuries meant destroying the damaged tissue so healthy tissue could regenerate. Purifying corrupted mana was eliminating the foreign elements while preserving the essence. He also grew closer to Lyra. Their friendship deepened into something neither of them had quite expected. She challenged him intellectually, pushing him to think about the philosophical implications of his power. If he could destroy anything, did that give him the right to judge what deserved destruction? If he could understand endings, did that mean he should prevent them or accept them? One evening, while studying together in the library, Lyra asked him a question that had clearly been on her mind for a while. If you could go back, before any of this started, before you knew about the seals, would you choose to remain magically null? To stay invisible and safe? Kael thought about it carefully. The old him, the invisible one, had been miserable, but also simple, uncomplicated, free from the weight of responsibility and expectation. The current him, with 1 seal cracked and 6 more waiting, carried burdens he couldn't have imagined. But he also felt alive in a way he never had before. Present, significant, real. No, he said finally. I wouldn't go back. Not because this is easy or safe, but because I'm becoming someone I actually want to be. The old me was invisible not by choice but by circumstance. The current me is choosing who to become. That choice, even with all the danger and responsibility, is worth more than safety ever was. Lyra smiled at that, and it was a smile of understanding. She reached across the table and took his hand. Not a romantic gesture exactly, more a gesture of connection, of two people who saw each other clearly and chose to stand together anyway. Good answer. But their moment of peace was interrupted by a magical alarm that sent every student in the library scrambling. It was the emergency warning, the kind that only sounded when the academy itself was under threat. Kael and Lyra rushed outside to find chaos. The sky above Astravelle had turned an unnatural shade of purple. Cracks were appearing in reality itself, like someone was shattering a mirror from the other side. And through those cracks things were emerging. Creatures made of shadow and void. Forms that hurt to look at, because they existed partially outside normal reality. Headmaster Blackwood's voice echoed across the grounds, amplified by magic. All students to defensive positions. Professors, establish perimeter barriers. This is not a drill. Kael felt the crimson power surge inside him, responding to the threat. But before he could act, he felt something else. A pulling sensation from deep inside. The azure seal, the second seal, was reacting. As if whatever was attacking the academy was specifically designed to trigger the next seal's failure. It's starting, Kael said to Lyra. The second seal, it's about to crack. She looked at him with worry but also determination. Then we handle it. Together. The void creatures were getting closer. Students who'd never seen real combat were panicking. Professors were throwing up barriers, but the creatures moved through them like they weren't even there. These weren't normal monsters. They were something else. Something fundamentally wrong. Kael reached deep inside, past the crimson seal to the azure one behind it. If destruction was about endings, creation was about beginnings. The power to bring forth something from nothing. To impose will onto reality so absolutely that new things simply existed. As the seal cracked, power flooded through him in a completely different way than the crimson aspect. This wasn't the awareness of endings. This was the awareness of possibilities, every potential outcome, every possible creation, every form that matter and energy could take. It was overwhelming in a completely different way. Where destruction showed him how things ended, creation showed him how things could begin. Acting on instinct, Kael raised his hands. Azure light, bright enough to rival the sun, burst from his palms. But he wasn't attacking, he was creating. Barriers formed from pure solidified will. Walls of force that the void creatures couldn't phase through because they weren't made of normal matter. They were made of imposed reality, of Kael's absolute conviction that they should exist. The creatures hit the barriers and recoiled, their void stuff sizzling where it made contact with the created matter. Kael could feel the strain of maintaining the constructs. But he could also feel something else. The two aspects, destruction and creation, beginning to work together. Using destruction to identify the weak points in the void creature's forms. Using creation to seal those weak points, to impose structure on beings made of chaos. Working in concert with the professors, Kael helped drive the void creatures back. Each one he touched with his combined aspects simply ceased to be void and became normal matter, which meant it became vulnerable to normal magic. The professors picked them off one by one. As the last creature fell, Kael felt the azure seal fully crack. The second aspect was now bleeding power just like the first. He collapsed, exhausted not from physical effort, but from the mental strain of wielding two fundamental forces simultaneously. Lyra was there, helping him up. That was incredible. You saved half the students in this academy. But Kael wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about what came next. 5 more seals, 5 more aspects, each one adding new layers of complexity, new ways to perceive reality, new powers that could help or harm depending on how he used them. The journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. As students and professors worked to repair the damage from the attack, Headmaster Blackwood pulled Kael aside. Those void creatures weren't random. Someone sent them. Someone who knew about your seals and wanted to trigger the next failure. This means your existence is no longer a secret. People out there, people with power and resources, know about you. And some of them will want to use you. Others will want to eliminate you. You need to be ready. Kael looked up at the sky, where the purple cracks were slowly healing, reality reasserting itself. How do I get ready for something like this? By becoming stronger. By learning control. By finding allies you can trust. And by never forgetting that the power inside you doesn't define you. How you choose to use it does. Blackwood paused. Your mother's message. Protect him until he's ready. I think I finally understand what she meant. Not ready to use the power. Ready to choose how to use it. And that, Kael, is something nobody can teach you. That's something you can only learn by living. By making choices. By becoming the person you decide to be. That night, Kael stood in his room, looking at his hands. One still glowing faintly crimson, the other azure. 2 aspects of 7. 2 seals cracked. 5 more waiting. The path ahead was uncertain, dangerous, filled with enemies he didn't know and challenges he couldn't predict. But it was his path, his choice, his becoming. He thought about his mother, that mysterious woman who died to give him this chance. He thought about the professors who'd chosen to protect him despite the danger. He thought about Lyra, who'd chosen to stand beside him despite the risk. And he thought about himself, about Kael Vornath, who'd gone from being nobody to being something that didn't quite have a name yet. Whatever he became, whatever the 7 aspects made possible, he was going to face it on his own terms. Not as a weapon, not as a threat, not as a prophecy or a curse or a calamity, but as a person, a student, someone who was still learning, still growing, still choosing with every breath what kind of person to become. The seals would fail. That was inevitable. But how he handled each failure, what he learned from each aspect, what kind of world he chose to create with all that power, that was still unwritten. That was still his to decide. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the crimson light of destruction and the azure glow of creation, beneath the 5 remaining seals waiting to crack, Kael felt something new stirring. Not fear, not confusion, but determination. He had 6 more aspects to unlock. 6 more challenges to face. 6 more chances to prove that power didn't have to corrupt. That strength could be chosen. That even someone born with the potential to reshape reality could choose to use that potential wisely. The journey from nobody to somebody was just beginning. And Kael Vornath was finally ready to take the next step. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more Manhwa recaps exploring hidden powers, mysterious academies, and overpowered protagonists discovering their true potential, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling me which seal you think Kael should unlock next and what kind of power it might bring. Until next time, keep reading, keep dreaming, and remember that everyone starts as nobody before they become somebody extraordinary.